Hello, this is the Bureau of Lost Culture. Welcome or welcome back if you've been with us before. You can check out everything that we've done before. bureauoflostculture.com. Here we are again in search of everything counterculture, underground, half forgotten, half remembered, rare oral testimonies and histories from the other side. Every single show, of course, is special and every single guest is special. But today we've got a very, very special guest. Me. In case you're wondering, that's narcissistic, Stephen. The reason is I've got a book out which I'm shamelessly puffing, and the book is called Bone Music. It's a history of the Soviet records of forbidden music cut onto X-ray during the Cold War era. You may have heard me talk about it before, in which case you could skip through this, but it's a bit different this show because the new book, Bone Music, which is just published by Strange Attractive Press, is an expanded, hidden history of this time, and it also includes completely new material about the very strange X-ray underground archivist culture of Budapest in the 1930s, and possibly a story of the man who invented the X-ray technique himself. I'm going to be interviewed by my friend Travis Elborough, cultural commentator, historian and author in his own right of many, many books. How many books is it now, Trav? A couple or so. So we're going to swap round. I'm going to sort of go on the other side of the microphone, and Travis is going to come on this side. Travis, welcome back. Last time you were talking about spectacles.
I was.
The countercultural history of spectacles.
Yeah.
And before that, we're talking about bootleg vinyl records.
We were talking about bootlegs. So there's a link there to
Yeah.
our current mode of topic and your latest book.
Mm.
And I guess we're also talking about hearing and listening and the desire to hear things which authorities may not want us to hear.
Right. Should we do it?
Let's go for it.
Okay.
So then, your new book is called Bone Music, and is a sort of a sequel volume to your earlier book, An Exhibition and Film, which explored the idea of Soviet bootlegs in particular, which were made on X-ray plates. To recap, in a sense, when did you first discover this extraordinary facet of audio technology hailing from the former Soviet Union?
Well, it's a story of how a flea market can change your life. Or in my case, actually, how an email can change your life, because I'd ended up playing with the Real Tuesday World in Russia live, because years before, I got an email from a Russian guy saying, I've made this animation with your music in it, is that okay? And I said, well, can I see it? And he sent it me, and I was blown away by it. That was a guy called Alex Badovsky, and we did this animation together for a track of mine called Bath Time in Clerkenwell, and the animation was a sort of massive hit in Russia, and as a consequence, we got invited to go and play there, and I ended up playing there many times over the years, and our habit when we played there was with our Russian friends the day after the show, sort of stagger, in a hangover haze to the nearest flea market and buy some stuff to take back, exotic Soviet stuff to take back to the UK. And in one particular occasion, I came across this strange-looking record. I brought it back to London and tried to play it, and it was single-sided. That was the first thing. 78 RPM, that was the second thing.
Did you have a player that could cope with those speeds?
Because I'm a big fan of sort of 30s music, so you can get a modern turntable that will play at 78. Took a bit of shunting on it, thinking what's going on, and then when it started to kind of crackle out, it was Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock. So it was just a kind of like, what on earth is going on here, and why does this record exist? But specifically, who made it, why did they make it, and how did they make it? And the previous book and this sets out to sort of answer those questions. And the difference between the previous book, which has been out of print, was that in the meantime I've been back to Russia several times and found out quite a bit more information, corrected some of the errors that were made in that book, some of the suppositions really, and sort of dug a lot deeper into what I think is the true bone music.
Obviously, you said it's rock around the clock. Bill Haley's great American rock and roll hit. With that drum beat, which sounds like a starting pistol on rock and roll. We should scroll right back to when censorship of music starts to kick in within the Soviet republics.
Yeah, so actually when censorship started in Russia was actually pre-revolution, so things were already being censored. There was a kind of proto-protest songs in the Tsarist regime, and there was cultural repression then. And of course what happened in 1918, 17 with the revolutions is that the Soviet Empire began, the Tsarist Empire was over. And actually they very, very quickly, they were really aware of the power of culture, and in the first few years, it was a very exciting time because it was a bit like we've got this new society. What is its cultural landscape? So experimentation was encouraged, and in terms of music, there was a lot of very weird, exciting avant-garde stuff going on. People making pieces which involved massed choirs and gunshots, huge horns, and these abstract pieces, and it was far more exciting, I think, and avant-garde than anything going on in the West. But really quickly, particularly with the ascent of Stalin, that stuff got closed down, and in fact very quickly began to be condemned as being sort of formalist. What the new Soviet Republic needs is music that's sort of inspiring for the common man and woman, simple stuff, which reminds them of their roots, and to most young people it's very dull stuff. But there was also, as the sort of waves of repression and cultural sort of investigation came and went, jazz was brought to the Soviet Union, and various other forms, more swingy kind of, klezmer type music, and really through the 20s and 30s that came and went, in terms of like whether it was encouraged, allowed, or viciously repressed.
There's rules, it's somewhat arbitrary, aren't there? With I think you write in the book as well, there's a kind of greater thaw during the Second World War, where obviously Stalin's Soviet Russia is part of the sort of Allied forces, and so therefore American records and things are considered acceptable for that period.
I don't know whether Stalin himself, it was probably with a sort of wrenching of his collar and a sort of lots of swallowing sort of allowed them. Of course, a lot of other stuff in terms of financial aid was pouring into the Soviet Union from America to help with the war effort, because we were kind of on the same team briefly. So along with that came these American cultural products, some clothes, films, even cars apparently. And so young people could go and see, American films like with Glenn Miller's soundtrack in Moscow and Leningrad. And of course it ignited in them a love of this stuff. Very difficult to understand quite often, why certain genres at certain times were repressed. My feeling is that generally speaking, what was approved of was the stuff that Stalin liked and understood. And like most dictators, they always seem to like fall to the floor, simple, big bombastic stuff. I mean, it just seems to be
marching music. Really.
Yeah,
something martial.
Yes, something martial, something kind of with grouped choirs and stuff. Yeah. I mean, it's like
this collectivist idea, though, isn't it? The more people are involved in this thing somehow or other, it takes on a much more credibility rather than the sort of individualistic. The idea of a virtuoso soloist, for example, it seems you can see why that might be considered sort of counter-revolutionary when you're supposed to be part of this collective whole.
I think you've nailed it there, actually. I mean, even now it's difficult to imagine, say, Kim Il-jung, isn't it, listening to Alice Coltrane.
No,
it's just not. It's not going to happen, is it? I think that was it in a way. It was this kind of the war between the individual or the individualist, as they would see it, and the collective.
You write in the book as well about Maxim Gorky. This was a big cultural influence on Russian life as a writer. And promoting, I guess, a kind of proletarian folk form of art, really, as the truer form. But he takes particularly against jazz you write in the book.
Yeah, well, there's this famous kind of piece that he writes, where he describes it as the sort of beating of a giant phallus, by a male stallion. And it's quite racist as well. You can tell there's undertones of references to jungles and beasts and things. It seems obvious to me that any young person reading that would think, I want some of that, right? Not, I mustn't listen to that, because Comrade Gorky, doesn't like it. I suspect that Gorky, he may not have liked it, but I think he understood it, because in a way he did get to the root of jazz somehow. It's kind of like it's the passion of it. With the intellectual, cultural totalitarians, I think that they did understand jazz. They did understand the power of music, and they were afraid of it.
I mean, there's another form of music which is really referred to as sort of gypsy music. Russian romance suddenly becomes, verboten as well.
So I think in that case, you've got two things, is that it was mainly being made by that stage anyway, by Russian emigres. So people like Pyotr Lyshenko, Konstantin Sokolsky, who were living outside the Soviet Union. So they were regarded as treacherous in themselves because they weren't living in the homeland. So that was one part of it. And the second part of it was that this Russian romance, Russian tango, these sort of sweeping, dramatic sounds and very passionate. It's called gypsy, and it gives you some sort of idea about it. If you think of like a flamenco dancer or something, it's got that kind of extravagance. And I think that itself was another sign of wild passions which can get out of control, unless they are controlled.
Distract the worker.
For young people in particular, they're going to arouse dangerous passions. It's all tied up with this kind of sexual repressiveness as well.
чужая милая, радость мечты моей. Как же тебя любил бы я до самых последних дней. Прошлое не воротится и не поможет слеза. Как целовать ты мне хочется, дочки твои глаза. Как же не сумели мы сберечь с тобою то, что жизни стоит, что зовут любовью в нашей дружбе осень.
A major figure in your book and also in the film, and covered by Mark Ormond in his album Orpheus in Exile, is Vadim Kozin, who you write was a very popular, really beloved, like a Frank Sinatra for Russia, who lives in some style in the Metropole Hotel in Moscow, while people are kind of ferreting around for turnips, they're starving to death and being sent to the gulags, and he then comes a cropper.
Yeah, well, I think Mark pinpoints that, doesn't he? Is that inside the Metropole, it was kind of champagne and caviar, and outside people were boiling shoes and, to actually make soup to live off. So there was that. Of course, ostensibly he was arrested and, accused of being a sort of deviant pervert of his homosexuality. But, they'd known that he was gay since the 1920s. And there's another theory, which is that either somebody had their eye on his money, but most likely, I think, is that he just become too famous and too beloved, and only room for one star in the Soviet Union, and that was Stalin. Anybody whose fame threatened to sort of like compete with that of the great leader had to be got rid of, And I think that's what happened to Kozin. His story is tragic, but at the same time, he was one of the lucky ones in a way, because when he got to Magadan, he was met at the station, with his guards, by the wife of the commandant of the camp where he was headed. And she basically took him aside because she was a huge fan of his music. And because of her intervention, and this is like the gold mining area, brutal stuff, you had a very short lifespan. And he was kept aside from that and was allowed to sort of perform and play in the camp orchestra. And it's a bizarre story, but some of the gulags, the commandants would compete with each other and the various musicians who'd been sort of ripped from stages and sent east, they would sort of form these orchestras, either for their own pleasure or as a sort of way of, competing with other gulags. So he managed to survive because of that, as did some other musicians. And even after it was all over and perestroika came right at the end of his life, he was too broken to return to the sort of scenes of his former glory. So he actually lived out his life in Magadan, in the town, in a small apartment.
He is an artist whose work is bootlegged using X-ray plates. We should probably say a bit about why X-ray plates and what.
So you can record onto many different types of surfaces. We're used to shellac and vinyl. Both of those use pressing techniques. It's a sort of, I'm not quite sure what it is. It's some sort of black plasticky stuff, isn't it? And then you press a master into it, and you can stamp out lots and lots of copies of it, right? Well, there's another way of recording, which is to use something called a recording lathe, which basically writes with a steel point or a sapphire point, and it scrapes an individual groove into the surface. That's how they make dub plates, right? And it's the first part even of the record pressing process. But those machines, which were invented really in the 30s for use by radio stations and journalists as a way of making an archive recording or a news report or recording a radio program. They manufactured kind of rubbery, soft stuff to write into. And of course, somebody, and maybe talk about that, discovered somewhere along the way that a very cheap way of doing that was to use recycled X-ray film, which is soft enough to scrape a groove into, and it's firm enough to hold it. So it's just serendipity, really.
And also that at that time people were having a lot of X-rays for TB, and these plates are highly flammable, and so the hospital had to get rid of them.
Yeah, certainly the Soviet Union, they couldn't keep them longer because there'd been some big conflagrations in Soviet hospitals, so it's like you've got to get rid of those things. Just as a note, by the way, you can record into all sorts of stuff. I know somebody's recorded onto a pizza base, and then know somebody in America, Michael Dixon, who's recorded onto a hi-hat. Heavy metal, obviously. Didn't sound that good, apparently, but so they were experimenting, and I think one of the main reasons of using X-rays is what you just referred to, is just the accessibility of it.
And in this book, you go into the Hungarian story, shall we say, which I think was something that you discovered or went deeper in since having done the first book. And in particular, is it István Mackay, who you suggest is possibly one of the pioneers of recording in this method?
He's definitely one of the pioneers. We speculate, was this the person that came up with the idea of recording on an X-ray? It might be, because he wrote about it extensively in the 1930s, and nobody, as far as I can find out, had written about it. And he wrote about it in detail, and he'd experimented with various other surfaces. The situation in Budapest in the 1930s was pre-communist Hungary, and really he was using X-rays because as conflict started to gather in Europe, it became much more difficult and expensive to get the commercial discs that they would use to record. He was building his own recording machines. He was a talented sound engineer. And he was getting employed by various people, in particular one person to make recordings of Bela Bartok, the Hungarian composer. He basically ran out of commercial discs. That was what happened, and he experimented to find out what else you could use,
And but he also didn't publish something pretty much how to do it, kind of guide really.
He did, and then he became the centre of a kind of community of self-recordists in Budapest, and these people were not doing it because they were creating bootlegs because music was forbidden. They were doing it for the pleasure of it, for the fun of it. I think at that time, in the 20s and 30s, with the advent of radio, it was an exciting thing. Do you know what I mean? It was like magic. And all around the world, there were like magazines and about that. And I think just for the pleasure of it, these people had a community of recording all sorts of stuff from radio and live onto X-rays,
And you mentioned two other characters who were sort of Hungarian jazz fans, Ivan Zagan and Radik Gabor. What were they recording? Were they?
Yeah, so there was a nascent Hungarian jazz scene, and in Budapest in particular. And for them, these were jazz players who just really wanted to hear themselves what they sounded like. It's a bit like a band now. They're making their first demo. It wasn't something that because the individual nature of recording with the lathe, that you could do to sell. So that they were just wanting to make recordings of what they sounded like live. And so the person that we met in Budapest, who's now sadly dead, had come across a cache of these recordings of homegrown Hungarian jazz bands, who'd just been recorded by archivists for the sake of history, if you like. And so it was a very different thing, but also equally exciting in a way.
And so if we move forward to the sort of post-war, so the Cold War, the froths of the Cold War kind of, come in. The Americans are sort of countering, beaming radio beams into Soviet Union, sort of music and propaganda, and the KGB are kind of doing their best to jam signals for this stuff. But there seems to be a couple of moments, this international festival in 1957, and then an American exhibition in 1959, which again seems to open up a bit of a door to certainly American music.
Yeah, definitely. So as the Khrushchev's thaw is actually how it's described, this kind of thaw in relations between the Cold War opponents. But also in terms of at home in the Soviet Union, it was a kind of cultural thaw. Obviously, Stalin had died on the job. Nobody was brave enough to actually take him down. I mean, the reason he died, of course, was that his doctors were too afraid to go near him in case they got blamed for killing him. So that's actually why he died, which serves him right, of course, for terrifying everybody all the time. But Khrushchev comes to power and been waiting in the wings, and then condemns much of what Stalin had been doing. Maybe saw the way the wind was blowing, and ushered in this cultural thaw. And the festivals that you talk about became part of that. The attitude towards jazz loosens up somewhat. Still not keen on improvisation, and as you pointed out earlier, the soloist, is not a figure that's held up in the Soviet Union for quite a long time. So it did start to change things, yeah.
And you mentioned also there's the Stilyagis, who are, I suppose, sort of proto-Russian hipsters is slightly the wrong word. I think it means style chaser, doesn't it? Or
style hunter.
Or
stylist, we might
say.
Stylist,
yeah. It's almost like the modernist or the mods in that vein. But who are these? These are a sort of generation of young kids who have an affinity with American style and music.
Yeah, they appeared quite early, and I think the first reference to them is in Crocodile, as they would say, which is a satirical magazine published in the Soviet Union. Very interesting magazine. Quite early on in the 40s, I think, somebody refers to this kind of peacock dressed, character with, loud colours and stuff. And he's a Stilyagi, he's a stylist. And that was the first time this word was used. And it was like, punk, goth, beatnik,
Incroyable as well, the
incroyables, hippies, it's like sort of term of abuse which then gets adopted by the people it's aimed at as a sort of, as a badge of honour. And they were young people who possibly had seen and heard American music in the war, and they got smuggled magazines and a few records and stuff, and were in love with American style. Of course, that was going on here too, wasn't it, in the UK? But we had a lot more access to it. And they started dressing as much as they could in like American style, getting their mums to kind of cut ties out of curtain materials and, extra thick soles put on shoes and stuff. All very bricolage, homemade, DIY stuff. Quite exaggerated, even by American standards.
It's like the swing teens in sort of Germany as well.
That's the Germany, the swing youth, and the swing youth. Yeah, exactly. A very similar thing. Because first of all, they were interested in that sort of music, swing music. Rock and roll came a bit later. And they really kind of carried on going until the early 60s, by which time they were looking very dated, even in the Soviet Union, because they didn't change that much. Some of them were rich kids, the sons and daughters of diplomats or high-level apparatchiks. Some were working-class kids as well. It was across, like youth culture is quite often across the class divisions, isn't it? In easier times, they would meet on Nevsky Prospect, which they rechristened Broadway. call each other bud.
Yeah.
They chew gum made out of paraffin wax, which sounds pretty disgusting.
It sounds somewhat desperate.
Sounds a bit desperate, yeah. And that was in easier times, and meet in secret in more tough times. They were hunted down actually by the Komsomolsk, the Soviet youth patrol, voluntary youth patrols, these sort of like vicious Boy Scouts and Girl Guides who were on the lookout for scroungers and loungers and antisocial elements as they called them, and they were quite badly abused at times. Had their quiffs forcibly cut off and the girls branded as sluts and stuff. It could get quite nasty, yeah. And
you mentioned also this amazing propaganda film, The Happiness of Difficult Roads. It's a great title.
It was a newsreel which would be showed before the main feature, in cinemas, and it's lambasting these scrounger, sponger, hooligan types, and contrasting them with the ideal Soviet youth, sort of doing wonderful athletic things with sort of firm muscles and choreography with each other, of course, which like we were talking before. And it's pretty heavy-handed stuff.
And probably didn't do much. Didn't really work. Maybe it did.
I think it worked in the sense that it got lots of young people more interested in rock and roll, in a sense, because it's like, I think as a young person, you're unlikely to see that stuff and think, oh yeah, I want to be one of the kind of the well-behaved.
Yeah.
Some people would, but lots of others would think, I want a bit of that.
Yeah. And what are they listening to, and how are they getting? I mean, the book includes interviews and profiles of some of the bootleggers. Ruslan Bogoslovsky and Boris Tagan are two names that spring to mind from that sort of era.
They were certainly the ones that appear to have been. They were there right at the beginning, particularly Bogoslovsky, in terms of becoming a bootlegger in Leningrad in the sort of second half of the 40s. They formed this, I'd call it an underground X-ray record company called the Golden Dog Gang, and they were using home-built, bootleg machines, which Bogoslovsky built himself. He's obviously a bit of a technical whiz, and they were music lovers and a bit entrepreneurial and very anti-establishment. And so they started off really, I think, out of a passion for the music and spreading that to their friends, but there was such an appetite for what they were producing, these bootlegs of jazz and X-ray and Russian forbidden music on X-ray, that it became a business, full-time business, and with dealers and the network, and like soft drugs basically, And so in some ways they seem to be the catalyst, and it started to spread from them to other people in Leningrad, and then to Moscow and Rostov and Kiev and other big cities.
Leningrad's important, isn't it, as well? In the same way that Liverpool is important, Liverpool and Newcastle are important for the story of British rock and roll.
Well, that's interesting. Tell me, I mean, I didn't know that Newcastle was that was an important place too, was it?
Yeah, for getting records from blues records and stuff coming in. So,
right. Well, the same thing. It's a port, so you've got sailors coming and going, and particularly in the case of the Soviet Union, it's quite far from Moscow, from central control. It's near the West. You can much easier to hear Western radio. And for people coming and going, they can smuggle stuff in. So as a sort of source for music and a source for making copies of records, it was perfectly placed. And it's always had, as St. Petersburg, then Leningrad, and even now as St. Petersburg, it's always had a kind of independent spirit. Like Liverpool and London. I mean, there's a sort of tension between them, isn't there?
Yeah. I mean, and they go to prison, Bogoslovsky, at least twice.
Three times. Three times, yeah. First time they got sentenced to, I think, 5 years. Yeah, they come out, and particularly in his case, just start again.
And some of that's in a way because they can't really do anything else.
Yeah, I think if you've been to prison, it was, and he was a talented engineer, possibly even intellectual person. So, but all those avenues of employment would have been closed to him after he'd served a prison sentence for being an antisocial element. So yeah, there's that. But I think also within his case, he wasn't going to be told what to do, and he did seem to be on a kind of quest to make better and better sounding and looking records. He's an innovator. And so the Golden Dog Gang, after the first rash of X-ray records, they were making these beautiful picture discs, some of which are in the book. And he kind of capped it all, really, and still couldn't work out how. He built a homemade record press in the bathroom of the shared apartment he was living in after his second prison term, and he worked out this technique of being able to get records of Stalin and Lenin's speeches, which you could buy very, very cheaply, heating the surface and flattening out the grooves, and then pressing
new record,
onto them, which is a very dangerous thing to do, and some people might say a very stupid thing to do, particularly because he got caught. So,
I mean, you also mentioned that people didn't necessarily always know what they were buying. Being given something that was supposed to be, Little Richard or Elvis or whatever, and they'd put it on and then find themselves somewhat disappointed.
Some waltz or something, yeah. So there's two aspects to that. That's absolutely true. So the positive aspect of it was that sometimes people would track down a dealer, in a dark alleyway or a colonnade or somewhere in particular, and they might have heard about a particular tune, which may be, Rock Around the Clock, for instance, right? And they want that record. Now, the dealer might not have that record, and if he sussed out this was a young, quite naive person, they would say, yeah, I've got that. I'll just go and get it for you, and nip round the corner, take a pen out, and write on there, Rock Around the Clock, right, and come back. Now, quite a lot of those kids, you see, they might not have even heard the record. They might have just heard of it.
Yes, the pre-Spotify era makes it be something the merchandise beforehand. I mean, that's just the case of buying records, isn't it? Wasn't it?
Yeah.
Often you wouldn't know what it sounded like until you got home. And you're stuck with it. I'm going to listen to this album regardless, even though I hate it.
And you might love it, you see. That was the other thing. So you might be lucky, and of course, with Kolya Vasin's case, that worked out very well for him in one particular occasion. But yeah, you might get some badly recorded Russian waltz or something, and, which was not what you were intending at all.
In the sky, that old moon giving us the eye. Come on and rock, baby. Come on and love, big guitar. I need your love. I need it now. I want your kiss. I want it now. Come on and rock, baby.
I think what happened is that from those first years when it was kind of driven by entrepreneurial music lovers, as people realised that money could be made, more and more kind of rascally people got involved, and they weren't very good at recording and didn't really care. They just wanted to kind of turn a buck or turn a ruble. So the sound quality was often terrible, and they would just pass off any old crap on people. Other people took pride in it, and they wanted to make good quality products and introduce people to music.
Yeah, I mean, you have this interviews with Mikhail Farafanov.
Mikhail Farafanov,
Farafanov. I apologise in advance to all native Russian speakers for the appalling pronunciation that I'm doing on these names.
We're not the first.
He speaks about wanting to, in a sense, to spread culture in a way, to be this force for change. But he also does mention he's making money. How is the balance between this to be? Were the Soviet authorities right to be anxious that was this going to bring down the Soviet Union, or were these, was it mainly just crooks taking advantage of a terrible situation?
I mean, it's a very good question, and I pondered on it a lot, and I think that we do tend to think in a kind of binary way a little bit about, like, you're either like a music lover or you're a kind of entrepreneur, you know what I mean? Or you're like, you love culture or you love money, And
so you're either John Peel or you're
Simon Cowell. Whereas in fact, well, particularly in the Russian mind, there's no need to distinguish between those two things. You can be both, or you're at least on a scale. And I think that were the authorities right in fearing this? In a way, yeah, I think they were, because this was an early expression of youth culture rebelling against the older generation who, were trying to dictate what people should listen to and love. So I think they did have something to fear there. They often couched it in terms of, hooligans trying to bring the system down, which they weren't. They were often just wanted to listen to their own music, like all young people do. The more sort of rascally bandit types who were just in it for the money. But there's always been people like that, haven't there? There's always been sort of dodgy car salesmen and stuff like, we're going to rip people off. And they are genuinely antisocial in a way,
You mentioned him already, but Kolya
Vasin, Vasin.
He was referred to as the Beatles guy.
He was famous, he was really famous in Russia because he'd been on TV a few times as the Beatles guy, and he was number one Beatles fan. Is the other way he was described by himself.
The self-appointed.
Self-appointed, which actually there were a few contenders for the role, but Collier seemed to have won out by virtue of his devotion. You know, as we were saying earlier, you know, you might not get what you expected when you bought an X-ray record. In his case, that definitely was. He'd been seeking out, I think, a Little Richard record or something, and he brought back a record and played it on his mum's gramophone player, and it was a Beatles record. And you know, it genuinely does seem to have caused an epiphany. You might call it a psychotic breakdown. Something happened to him, and he, you know, devoted his life since that moment to the moment he died a couple of years ago to the Beatles. And you know, and he lived it. He just lived it. He lived preaching the gospel of rock and roll, and particularly of John Lennon, sitting in the temple of John Lennon as he built it in St. Petersburg, you know, surrounded by strange organic temples to the Beatles that he'd built, and huge amounts of kind of miscellanea and merch and stuff, you know, which people had given him, and a sign pointing, saying how many miles it was to Liverpool and pointing in the right direction, and playing Beatles music, you know, in wreaths of smoke. It was quite something, yeah.
And the Beatles, I think you seem to suggest, represented a particular problem for the Soviet authority, or appear to have done. They seem to have been particularly demonized, or they were feared. The effect they would have on the young was considered rather more extreme, maybe even than Elvis, possibly.
I think that was also the case in the West, though, wasn't it? I mean, you know, the Beatles. It's quite interesting with the Beatles in particular. What was it about them? Was it just that they were the first? You know, that these four mop tops, you know, seemed to be like young gods to young people, and causing this hysteria, particularly in young girls, right? You know, and so that hysteria in the West was very alarming to people, wasn't it? You know, and I don't really know what it was. We've talked to various people about it. You know, what is it about the Beatles and about Beatles music which was so transformatory and inspiring? And in the Soviet Union, that was absolutely the case. There was never going to be like Beatlemania because young people couldn't gather in that way in concerts. But for people like Collier, you know, the Beatles seem to represent another universe, a happier place, far from the grey restraint of Leningrad, the oppression of that, where you could be free. You know, he talked about them in religious terms. One of the strange and a little bit sad things that happened in a conversation with him is that he said to me once, "Do you want to see my family album?" Which is a traditional thing in Russia. You'd have a kind of photo album of your ancestors, you know, your grandparents and great parents and family and stuff. And I said, yeah, sure. And I thought, I wouldn't mind seeing a picture of his long-suffering mother, you know, actually, who sort of spent all his dinner money on records, X-ray records. And he opened it up, and it was all the Beatles. It was just the Beatles, particularly John Lennon. Yeah. And I was going through it, and I was like, wow, you know, and I got partway through, and there's in the page it said, John Lennon, my daddy, right? And I didn't mean that literally, but he meant it in some sort of, you know,
sort of almost a spiritual sense.
Spiritual sense, yeah. So I said to him, "Wow!" I said, "Cole, you know, I mean, you must have been absolutely devastated when he was murdered." And he just looked at me and said, "Oh, he's not dead." And I was like, "Right, okay." And he said he's living in northern Italy.
Doing what?
Well, we sort of questioned him a bit about it, and it basically seemed that John Lennon had kind of like, you know, gone into some sort of spiritual retreats away from the world, you know. But more interesting than that is that not only that, he'd been producing music ever since. And Collier pointed to his shelf, and he had a whole row of CDRs of music that John Lennon had been producing over the last.
Play any of it?
Of course. So I said to him, "That's amazing. Like, can we hear some?" And he was a bit reluctant. Maybe, I don't know whether one part of his mind was thinking, you know, they're taking the piss, which we weren't, or whether he had his own doubts, which he may have done, or maybe these were like precious things which shouldn't be played for the uninitiated. Yeah. But he did put a couple of tracks on, which I sneakily recorded on my phone in the room, and guess what? Sounded exactly like John Lennon. It sounded like John Lennon in a room working out a song.
And where had Collier sourced these recordings from?
Well, apparently he had there was a sort of secret community of people who were connected with Lennon in northern Italy. And with passing these recordings amongst themselves. I have got it
So you've
somewhere.
heard it here first on
I might
Soho
even
Radio that John Lennon is alive and well and living
He's alive
in
and
northern
well,
Italy.
yeah.
And still making music.
Paul, my collaborator in this whole endeavour, says that he thinks it sounds like a Japanese person doing a really good impersonation of Lennon. It's actually quite a good song.
How did Paul manage to surmise that?
I suppose he's very familiar with Lennon and maybe a little bit with the Japanese voice. But yeah, so it's actually a very nice Beatlesy sounding song. You know.
I mean, you also talk about how there were enforced haircuts, and you couldn't grow your hair long under the Soviet.
Yeah, I mean, Kolya told us about being. He was at the train station one day and just an ordinary citizen shouting at him and grabbing him by his sort of longish hair and dragging him along the platform by his hair, Then that was... Mikhail Farafanov said, he's travelling in the north to sell records, and he was on a bus and he was sort of dressed in an American raincoat because he was making a bit of money. And, he was attacked on the bus. And this is by other Soviet citizens. It wasn't, by the officials. So there was a kind of... There was a resistance to that, even at the ground level, yeah.
I mean, and how did Collier? I mean, his mother. He was using his dinner money to acquire his records. That's something I did when I was a teenager as well. I'd get my dinner money and I'd have like a bag of crisps for lunch and pocket the rest of the money, and then to the end of the week go and buy a record.
Noble tradition. Of
exactly. That. Yeah. So I have great sympathy for that, but. How did he manage to hide his habit, or didn't he? I mean, was it an open secret, or? I
mean, I don't think he could hide it in a sense. I think he was very close to his mum, and she was very much aware of his Beatles obsession, certainly. And I think I get the impression he was an only child and he was quite indulged as well. I mean,
he was a collector rather than a producer, wasn't he?
Yes, yeah. He never made music or sold or made records. He was a collector and a consumer, and an advocate, really, So I suspect his mum was worried about it and, was concerned for him, but was kind of indulgent of him. Another person, Igor Brill, who's a pianist, who learnt his chops from X-Ray Records by playing along with Boogie Woogie and stuff, He said, I think, when he was young that his mum was so concerned about him buying these records that she wrote him a letter about it, saying, my dear son, I'm really concerned. He said the strange thing about it was that they shared a room. So she was in the same room when she wrote the letter and then just handed it to him. Yeah.
Was that? I mean, was she fearing it being bugged, or was it just
possibly, yeah, or the neighbours hearing or something, or maybe it was just that the sort of the seriousness of it. You know what I mean? She parental letter to.
Yeah, I mean, in a sense,
the wayward child.
Obviously, his mother knew he had bootleg records, and vice versa. But how well known was the bootlegging among ordinary Russian citizens at the time, and since, I guess, really once the arrival of reel-to-reel tape recorders, which, in a sense, caused time on bone music and replaces a different form of bootlegging.
1964, 64 and 66, reel-to-reel tape recorders, which had been around, since the 40s, but they'd been completely inaccessible to ordinary citizens. And part of Khrushchev's thaw was this liberalisation of people getting hold of consumer products, fridges and things like that. I'm not sure about TVs, but yeah, bizarrely, after all that punishment and persecution and propaganda, they allowed people to have their own reel-to-reel tape recorders. It seems nuts, because what were they expecting people would do? Record speeches of Soviet leaders off the radio? No, they immediately started to use them to share, as we would say, the music they wanted to listen to. And when you can record at home, at length, 20 minutes aside, and at quality, why would you bother with this? An X-ray record, 3 minutes of scruffy, crackly sounding stuff, which you've got to go on the street to buy off a dodgy person. It just virtually overnight just disappeared.
Was there a trade in bootleg tapes?
Massive. I mean, Troitsky, Artemy Troitsky thinks that there was less than 1 million X-ray records ever made. It's difficult to quantify, but he reckons there was tens, if not hundreds of millions of bootleg tapes circulated. Rudy Fuchs, who is in the book, who was sent to prison for bootlegging. Later in the tape era, he built up his record collection again, and he would rent his entire record collection out to people for the afternoon, and
So
they
they
just
could tape them,
they could tape it. Yeah.
Mhm.
And then tapes of tapes, second
Mhm.
generation and stuff, and then later on, the homegrown Russian rock scene of the sort of early 70s, they were making albums onto reel to reel, which were then being copied, and some of those bands like Aquarium and stuff, they became underground stars entirely by the circulation of their music on reel to reel tapes, and like huge underground stars, yeah.
And I mean, was there a similar profit motive behind doing some of those tapes as well?
No, it was in their case, because this was still pre the era where you could have official concerts. All the concerts had to be underground. They were all broke, actually. They were definitely for the love of it. They've since become well-to-do and wealthy, but some of them have. But at that time, that was the only way to get their music out there. So people knew about them all over Russia, but had no chance of seeing them play, and there's no chance of them making an official record until much later.
And how well known was the phenomena of X-ray records? But has more information come about through your excavation of this phenomenon?
Yeah, I mean, it's a source of sort of pride and puzzlement, and I don't want to come across as puffing what Paul and I have done up, but we do seem to have been the first people to dig deep into this in Russia and in Hungary, actually, particularly in Hungary, actually. But there wasn't much known about it before. I don't quite understand it still. It seemed to either be not regarded with any importance in Russia, or it was part of a rather shameful era. It was a dark history which should be kind of quickly forgotten about. So when we did our exhibitions in Russia, young people, by which I mean people under the age of 30, would come on. They never heard about it. It was as startling to them as it might be to somebody here. Older people knew about it or vaguely remembered it, But also, I think an important thing to remember is that for the intelligentsia in Soviet Union, they despised it too, even though they might secretly listen to jazz and stuff, because it was a street culture. Like smoking weed or something. People might look down on sort of that kind of street culture, graffiti. So, and as soon as there's no need for it, it was kind of shoveled under the carpet,
And I mean, you write the book in a way that obviously we tended to have the assumption, obviously, that all the music they would be attempting to bootleg would be Western. It would be the Beatles. It would be Elvis. It would be Bill Haley or Little Richard. But actually, you argue that in fact far more sort of Russian, native music in a sense, Russian music was bootlegged than the sort of American or Western kind of import.
This book, particularly compared with the first one, goes into that, because I think the true bone music is the Russian forbidden music, the music we talked about earlier, the forbidden emigre songs, the disgraced singers like Kozin, or the homegrown urban blues. You might even call it Soviet soul music, not in terms of its rhythms, but in terms of its essence. The songs sung in the gulags and in the trenches and in the kitchens and in the courtyards behind the apartment blocks about real life in the Soviet Union's life, suffering, and comic as well, and songs about criminals. It wasn't just all sorrow, and that stuff which showed real life and the dark underbelly of it was completely forbidden. So there was no opportunity to record it apart from, on X-ray and then later on tape.
Я спою о стране, где когда-то родился, от которой судьба отклонила мой путь, вспоминая о ней, я не раз прослезился, но я уж никто мне не сможет вернуть. Вспоминая о ней, я не раз прослезился, но я уж никто мне не сможет вернуть. Я тоскливо смотрю в вышину голубую.
So in a way, it's not as glamorous a story to the West in terms of Cold War politics. They wanted our great stuff, right? And they couldn't get it. But it's a much more poignant story, because this was their own music, which was
being
forbidden
withheld
and
from them,
repressed. Their own culture. They were separated from their own culture, and I thought that was a much more tragic story, really.
And obviously, with events in Ukraine, censorship is obviously becoming an issue once again in Putin's Russia. Where do you think these records sit in some of that story? Is it a kind of an unfortunate chapter in a continuing series of repressions? Does it have anything to sort of tell us and the Russians themselves about power and culture and control?
Yeah, what does that say, right? So certainly I and most people I know, and I've got many Russian friends, were shocked, not necessarily by the invasion of Ukraine, but at the speed at which Russia has unwound back into a kind of Soviet type of cultural repression. Now, in terms of music, the horse has bolted because of the internet, so it's not really possible for, even if he wanted to, for Putin to say, censor styles of music. It's all out there, right?
Yeah.
But also I think that the music hasn't got the power maybe now that it had anyway. The cultural threat is from other sources, maybe news media and maybe even theatre and film and stuff like that. So there's not an attempt, as far as I'm aware, to sort of stop Western music or stop certain genres. But certainly any Russian musicians who were even thinking about writing something, either in their music or just in terms of making announcements at concert stuff, which was seen as anti-war, would get in deep trouble. And that's what's happened. There's a guy, famous old rocker, who made some comments, at a concert and was immediately arrested. And several of those kind of people have already left the country, and some of them are actually making anti-war, protest type songs. The rappers mainly, actually, from abroad, but they couldn't do it in the country, and that stuff wouldn't be played. So Kirill Serebrennikov, the film director and theatre director, seems to be continually under house arrest. His productions are being cancelled, and finance for any productions of anybody who's expressing anti-government sentiments is not going to happen. So that's that kind of financial censorship.
I mean, and also there's the channels as well, like television channels and that, which have been closed, and
radio stations being closed. Yeah,
exactly.
Yeah,
so in that respect, in a way, you can see some limitation on what people would hear or see on the basis of almost just that alone, wouldn't it?
Yeah.
Rather than
So this was the second part of your question: is what do these records, these bone records, have they got anything to say about this? Yeah, I think they have. I mean, there's going to be a small group of people, and there's a small group of people inside Russia now who are protesting and are spreading their own culture. It's so they're kind of testament to that, this sort of indomitability of people when it comes to finding a way, and from acorns grow oak trees. And these records, they didn't change the world. They didn't bring down the Soviet system, but their distribution led to distribution of bootlegs on reel-to-reel, then on cassette, and then via other means, and then people started to gather and do secret concerts, and those secret concerts revealed something to young people in particular, and it had its effect, and I'm sure that's going on too. I have to say as well, the Russian-Ukrainian conflict, and I completely condemn what Russia have done, but it's a very complex, multi-faceted, nuanced thing, and culturally Russian and Ukraine overlap. I know several Russian friends who were born in the Ukraine, and go between the two. It's much more porous.
Kozin was Ukrainian born, wasn't he, as well?
Lyshenko was Ukrainian, and Alex Khan, my friend from the BBC, the Russian correspondent, he's born in Ukraine but grew up in Leningrad.
I mean, Lyshenko, I think you say, was actually the most bootlegged on Bone.
He appears more than anybody else. A wonderful singer as well, and he had his own cabaret in Bucharest, and where he entertained the great and good, and so he's regarded as a degenerate figure. Died in a Romanian prison camp in the end, and his voice was described as transporting maybe an older generation of Soviet citizens to a kind of a beautiful other world. There was something in the quality of his voice.
And I think you said that there are now growing market in bootlegs, i.e. like fake xray records.
Yeah, well, when my sort of modest collection was mainly made in the early days, when I could still go in flea markets in Russia and find them, for virtually nothing. And then what happened after the publication of the book, and then particularly after the exhibition in Moscow, is that quite rightly they cottoned onto this. So the flea markets have been sort of, assets stripped of any bone records, and they've been sold on the internet. And then I think maybe as the suppliers run out, there seem to be some various entrepreneurial Russians who are now making bootlegs, fake X-ray records. Because I keep getting people keep writing to me saying, "Oh, I love your project," and like I got a record too, and they sort of saying it's like the Doors, Light My Fire, and it's like, that's not an original record. It can't be. They stopped making them in '64. So
yeah, exactly.
That's the first clue. Black Sabbath. You don't get Black Sabbath on an X-ray record. So you can't. The Russians are ingenious, and it's their culture, and it's all in the spirit of bootlegging, isn't it? So who am I to complain? I try to let people down gently, or say, "Oh, that's really great," and it doesn't matter if people think it's what it is.
Yeah,
right? They get
exactly.
pleasure out of it.
They're still getting an artifact,
yes.
aren't they?
Of
a time,
and they look great. Yeah, so
exactly. A genuine fake.
A genuine fake, exactly. Yeah. And like Orson Welles says in F for Fake, does it really matter if you don't know? No, of course it doesn't.
But for those who would like to know more, the book is called Bone Music by Stephen Coates. It is published by Strange Attractor Press, and it's a very attractive volume with great pictures and a sort of whole series of wonderful plates of the picture discs, and so well worth purchasing.
Thanks very much, Travis.
Pleasure, Stephen.
Or are you supposed to say thanks very much to me?
Thanks very much, Stephen.
It was a pleasure, Travis.
Get confused in our roles here all of a sudden.
Travis, thanks very much. And this is your third appearance. Come back and do some more. You're a countercultural figure in your own right. We should talk more about countercultural books, perhaps. So that's it. I'm sure you've heard enough of my voice for today, so I'm going to keep this outro very short. Thanks for Travis for interviewing me about my new book. Thanks for listening. You can join us at bureauoflostculture.com. Thanks to Server Radio. We'll see you, hear you next time for more tales from the underground.
Брось недобрые, темные думы на меня без укора гляди, расставаясь не будем угрюмы, чтобы ни было все впереди. Не хочу я, чтоб новая складка возле губ